The widowed mother just wanted a job, and she agreed to take care of the triplets. But the millionaire's children were spoiled, cruel, almost unbearable, until she saw a hidden scene that would change everything forever. Behind the mansion, there was a secret that could turn the whole game around. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. Helen watched the rain through the window of the small apartment while organizing the latest bills on the kitchen table. The numbers didn't add up no matter how many times she recalculated. Her salary as a substitute teacher barely covered the rent, and the expenses for her 6-year-old son, Michael's special care, consumed all the savings that remained. Her eyes fell on the living room bookshelf, where an old book with a red and gold cover caught her attention. It was the storybook that Peter, her husband, used to read to Michael every night. Even on the most difficult days when the boy had sensory overloads and couldn't calm down, his father's soft voice narrating those magical stories always soothed him. Since Peter left them 3 months ago, due to a sudden and unpredictable heart condition, Helen had struggled to keep her son's routine as stable as possible. Michael, with his particular world and unique way of communicating, deeply felt his father's absence, especially at bedtime. A loud thunderclap made Michael run from the living room to her bedroom, his little footsteps echoing down the hallway. Helen found him huddled under the covers, hands covering his sensitive ears from the noise. Without hesitation, she took the storybook and sat beside him. "How about a story, my love?" she whispered, carefully opening the book. The yellowed pages had the familiar smell of Sunday afternoons and Peter's hugs. Michael approached slowly, his curious eyes fixed on the colorful illustrations. While reading, Helen noticed something she had never perceived before. Between the pages of the book, there were small notes made by Peter. They were observations about Michael's reactions to each story, details about his favorite moments, and even suggestions for different voices for each character. It was at this moment that the phone rang, interrupting the reading. It was a call that would completely change the course of their lives. On the other end of the line, a formal voice asked if she would be interested in a nanny position for triplets. The salary offered was 3 times her current income. "I should inform you that the children have special needs," said the voice. "They've already gone through several caregivers, and none have managed to establish an adequate connection." Helen looked at Michael, who was now browsing the book on his own, completely absorbed in the illustrations. His small fingers traced the contours of the drawings with the same delicacy that Peter used to have when turning the pages. "I completely understand about special needs," Helen replied, her voice gaining confidence. "When can I start?" "If possible, tomorrow," replied the voice. "The address is 1234 Magnolia Street, the Blackwood Mansion." Helen knew that address. It was one of the largest properties in town, surrounded by high walls and gardens that were once luxuriant, but now seemed as abandoned as the stories that circulated about its residents. "There's just one non-negotiable condition," the voice continued, taking on a more serious tone. "Never under any circumstance mention the children's mother." Before Helen could question this strange requirement, the call ended. She sat there on the bed, still holding the phone, while Michael continued his silent exploration of the storybook. She looked again at the bills scattered on the kitchen table, visible through the open bedroom door, then at her son, so absorbed in his own particular world. The decision was already made in her heart before her mind had processed all the implications. She took the storybook and hugged it against her chest, as if seeking Peter's strength and wisdom from it. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, and she would need all the courage she could gather. The next morning dawned cold and foggy, as Helen, firmly holding Michael's hand, crossed the iron gates of the Blackwood Mansion. The garden, once famous for its exuberant flowers, was pervaded by a melancholic air. Withered roses and abandoned flower beds silently told a story of absence and neglect. The imposing building rose before them like a sleeping giant. The tall dark windows seemed to observe them with suspicion, while the grey stone facade emanated a coldness that made Helen instinctively press the storybook against her chest. She had brought it as a talisman. Michael, sensitive to environmental changes as always, clung more tightly to his mother's hand. His eyes scanned every detail of the place with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Helen knew how to interpret each small gesture from her son. The way he slightly bit his lower lip indicated he was processing a large amount of sensory information. Before they reached the main door, it opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with gray hair tied in a severe bun and an austere expression. "Mrs. Walker?" she asked in a controlled voice. "I'm Ruth, the housekeeper. Mr. Edward is waiting for you in his office." Helen and Michael were led through silent corridors, where paintings covered with white cloths looked like ghosts on the walls. The sound of their footsteps echoed on the marble floor, creating an even more solemn atmosphere. Michael squeezed his mother's hand with each new environment, his eyes fixed on the geometric patterns of the floor. The office was a spacious room, dominated by a solid mahogany desk. Behind it, a tall and elegant man, appearing to be about 40 years old, was staring out the window. At the sound of the door closing, he turned slowly. "Mr. Edward," Ruth announced, "Mrs. Helen Walker and her son, Michael." Edward Blackwood had deep, tired eyes, the kind of gaze that carried too many stories to tell. His face, though young, seemed marked by old worries. He observed Helen for a few moments before speaking, his gaze briefly shifting to Michael, who was now visually exploring the bookshelves that covered the walls. "Mrs. Walker," he began, his deep voice filling the room, "I confess I didn't expect you to bring your son on the first day." "I apologize," Helen replied firmly, "but I thought it better to be transparent from the start. Michael is an inseparable part of my life, and if I'm going to care for your children, I need to make sure there's space for him too." A heavy silence followed her words. Edward studied her more carefully, as if reassessing his decision to hire her. It was then that a sound of breaking glass echoed through the corridor, followed by children's shouts. "The triplets are awake," Ruth announced, her voice carrying a note of resignation. Edward closed his eyes for a moment as if seeking patience. "Ruth, please take Mrs. Walker to meet the children and—" He hesitated, looking at Michael. "Show the boy one of the guest rooms. He can stay for today until we decide on the next steps." Helen followed Ruth through the corridors, the sounds of agitation growing closer. Michael walked beside her, still, absorbed in the floor patterns, occasionally stopping to trace invisible shapes in the air with his fingers, his particular way of processing new environments. As they turned the last corridor, Helen finally saw the triplets. 3 children of approximately 8 years old, 2 girls and a boy, were standing in front of a broken vase. But it wasn't the scene of destruction that caught Helen's attention. It was the expression on their faces. A mixture of defiance and vulnerability that she knew well from seeing it daily in her own son's eyes. The boy, in particular, kept himself apart from his sisters, his hands moving in repetitive patterns while his eyes avoided direct contact with anyone. Helen immediately recognized the signs. They were the same ones Michael exhibited in sensory overload situations. Helen carefully observed the 3 children before her. The girls, Claire and Sophia, were physically identical, but their behaviors were distinctly different. Claire maintained a defensive posture, arms crossed and a defiant look, while Sophia partially hid behind her sister, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her blouse. Caleb, the boy, remained a few steps away from his sisters, his eyes fixed on a distant point of the wall, where a floral wallpaper created complex geometric patterns. His hands moved in the air as if drawing invisible shapes, very similar to the gestures Michael usually made. It was actually Michael who broke the ice of that first meeting. Without any hesitation or awareness of the tension in the environment, he approached Caleb, his eyes following the same pattern on the wall that had captured the other boy's attention. For a moment, the two remained side by side, their hands tracing similar patterns in the air. "He sees the shapes too?" asked Caleb softly, his first sentence since Helen had arrived, still not shifting his gaze from the wall. "Yes," Helen replied, gently. "Michael always finds interesting patterns where other people just see decoration." Claire took a step forward, her defensive posture softening slightly. "Caleb draws the patterns he sees," she explained, a touch of fraternal pride in her voice. "He has notebooks full of them. As if responding to a cue, Caleb finally averted his gaze from the wall and walked to a nearby desk, from which he retrieved a sketchbook. With precise and deliberate movements, he opened to a specific page and showed it to Michael. The drawing was an intricate reproduction of the same floral pattern from the wall, but transformed into a kind of hypnotizing geometric maze. Michael was fascinated. His fingers hovered over the drawing without touching it, instinctively respecting the other boy's work. Helen felt her heart tighten at that moment of silent connection between the two children. "Do you have more drawings?" Helen asked, addressing all the children. Sophia, still partially hidden, nodded timidly. "Caleb has a room just for drawing," she whispered, "but we can't show anyone. Those are the rules." Helen noticed a shadow pass over Ruth's face, the housekeeper, who was observing the scene with an expression difficult to decipher. The rules seemed to be a sensitive topic in the mansion. "How about we start our day with a story?" Helen suggested, taking the storybook from her bag. "This book is very special to Michael and me. It has wonderful stories that might be even more interesting if they're shared." Claire frowned, suspicious. "We're not babies anymore to hear stories," she declared, but Helen noticed how her eyes fixed on the golden cover of the book. "Stories aren't just for babies," Helen responded, with a gentle smile. "Sometimes they help us better understand the world around us, and some of them have illustrations that seem to dance on the pages." At the mention of illustrations, Caleb turned his attention to the book, clearly interested. Sophia took a small step out from her protected position behind her sister. Helen opened the book to one of the pages marked by Peter, where a particularly beautiful illustration showed an enchanted garden. The notes in the margins indicated that this was one of Michael's favorite stories. "This is the story of the Garden of Memories," Helen began, her voice taking on the soft tone that Peter always used during nighttime readings, "a place where each flower kept a special memory." As she read, something extraordinary happened. The children gradually approached. First Caleb, who sat on the floor near Michael, his sketchbook still open on his lap. Then Sophia, who found a place near the window, her legs crossed and eyes fixed on the illustrations. Finally, even Claire, still maintaining a cautious distance, leaned against the wall to listen. Ruth observed the scene with a mixture of surprise and something that seemed like hope in her tired eyes. It was the first time in a long time that she had seen the triplets so calm and receptive to a new presence in their routine. In the days that followed, Helen established a gentle but consistent routine in the mansion. The mornings began with stories from the storybook, which now remained strategically positioned in the living room, its worn pages holding not only Peter's notes, but also small drawings that Caleb had begun to add in the margins. Edward Blackwood, initially resistant to Michael's presence, was surprised to notice how the boy had become a natural bridge between his son Caleb and the outside world. The two boys developed their own language, made of gestures and drawings, which gradually began to include the girls as well. On a particularly quiet afternoon, while the children were absorbed in their activities in the living room, Helen noticed something curious. Several of the paintings covered with white cloths had small pencil marks at their bases. Approaching one of them, she realized they were numbers, apparently made by Caleb's hand. "They're codes," Sophia explained in a low voice, timidly approaching Helen. "Caleb catalogues everything he considers important." Claire, who pretended not to be paying attention while flipping through a magazine, added, "He started doing that after Mum. After she went away." Helen felt the weight of those unspoken words. It was the first time any of the children had mentioned, even if indirectly, their mother. The silence that followed was broken by the soft sound of piano coming from somewhere in the mansion. "Dad is playing," Sophia whispered, her eyes lighting up. "He only plays when he's—" "Shh," Claire abruptly interrupted her sister. "We can't talk about that." But Helen had already noticed. The sound was coming from the west wing of the mansion, an area that Ruth had specifically instructed them to avoid. The piano notes, though distant, carried a melancholy that seemed to echo through the empty corridors. Caleb, who until then was concentrated on his sketchbook along with Michael, suddenly stood up and began looking for something on the shelves. With precise movements, he removed a large dusty album, its pages yellowed by time. "Caleb, no!" Claire tried to stop him, but her brother had already opened the album to a specific page. It was an old photograph showing a group of people in a lush garden, the same garden that now withered outside the mansion. In the center of the image, a young and radiant woman smiled while playing a white grand piano surrounded by flowers. Helen felt her heart tighten as she recognized in that woman's features the same expressive eyes as the triplets. Even more surprising was noticing, partially visible in the corner of the photo, a figure that seemed familiar to her, an elegant woman who appeared to be observing the scene with particular interest. Before she could examine the image better, heavy footsteps in the corridor announced Ruth's arrival. With surprising agility, Claire put away the album while Sophia covered Caleb's drawings with some magazines. Michael, sensing the sudden tension, instinctively sought Helen's hand. "Mr. Edward requests your presence in his office, Mrs. Helen," announced Ruth, her formal tone masking a note of concern. Immediately, as she followed the housekeeper through the corridors, Helen couldn't shake from her thoughts the image of that woman in the corner of the photograph. There was something disturbing about her expression, something suggesting that the secrets of the Blackwood mansion were even more complex than she had imagined. The sound of the piano had ceased, but its echo seemed to remain in the walls, like a persistent reminder of untold stories. Helen unconsciously tightened the pendant she wore around her neck, a gift from Peter that always helped her find courage in difficult moments. In the office, Edward was standing by the window, his silhouette cut against the faint light of the late afternoon. Without turning, he began to speak in a controlled tone that barely disguised his tension. "Mrs. Walker, I received a call today that worried me greatly," he said, finally turning to face her. "Are you familiar with the Circle of Light organization?" Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. The name was familiar, an internationally recognized NGO known for its work with neurodivergent children. But there was something more, something she couldn't pinpoint at the moment. "Only by name," she replied cautiously. "Their founder, Dr. Regina Andrews, got in touch. Edward hesitated, running his hand through his hair in an evident gesture of discomfort. "She was the school coordinator for the Triplets before founding the NGO, and now she's questioning your ability to care for the children." Helen felt her blood freeze. For what reason? According to her, you don't have formal qualifications to deal with neurodivergent children. She's suggesting that the Triplets, especially Caleb, need specialized professional monitoring. Edward approached his desk, picking up an envelope. She sent a formal proposal to include the children in an experimental program at the NGO. Helen observed the envelope in Edward's hands, suddenly remembering the figure in the photograph she had seen earlier. The woman in the corner of the image. Could it be the same person? "Mr. Blackwood," Helen began, carefully choosing her words, "I may not have specific diplomas, but I have practical experience. As Michael's mother, I've learned that each child is unique and that sometimes what they need most is someone who listens and respects their own pace." Edward studied her for a long moment before responding. "I know. I've observed the changes in the children since you arrived. Caleb is drawing more than ever. Sophia has started talking during meals, and even Claire." He smiled slightly. "Well, she stopped trying to escape through the bedroom window." A comfortable silence established between them, broken only by the distant sound of children's laughter coming from the garden. Edward walked to the window again, and Helen followed him. Down below, the four little ones were sitting in a circle on the grass, apparently absorbed in some activity. "They're happy," Edward murmured, more to himself than to Helen. "I haven't seen them like this since." His voice faltered, and Helen realized it was the first time she had seen him display vulnerability. His eyes were fixed on the children, but his thoughts seemed to be elsewhere, in another time. "Dr. Regina," he continued after a moment, his voice firmer. "She was very present in my wife's life during the last year, always insisting that the children needed specialized treatment, that we were failing as parents for not following her recommendations." Helen felt her heart tighten. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that increasingly worried her. "The children showed me something today," she said softly. "A photo album. There was an image of your wife at the piano, in the garden." Edward turned abruptly, his eyes widened. "They never show that album to anyone, never." "There was a woman in the photo," continued Helen, "observing the scene. Was it Dr. Regina?" Before Edward could answer, they were interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Ruth entered hastily, her normally composed face now marked with concern. "Sir, there's someone at the door." "It's Dr. Regina. She's demanding to see the children immediately." Edward turned pale, but his voice remained firm. "Ruth, take the children inside. Mrs. Walker, please stay with them. I'll deal with this." As she followed Ruth to the garden, Helen couldn't help but notice how Edward's shoulders tensed, as if he were preparing for a long-deferred battle. The sound of high heels on the marble floor echoed through the corridors of the mansion as Helen hurried the children toward the library. Michael, sensitive to the tension in the air, clung to her hand, while the triplets followed in silence, exchanging worried glances among themselves. Caleb, however, stopped abruptly in the middle of the path. With quick and precise movements, he took his sketchbook from his backpack and began to frantically flip through the pages. "Not now, Caleb," whispered Claire, pulling her brother's arm. But the boy was determined. He finally found the page he was looking for and showed it to Helen. The drawing made her heart stop for a moment. It was a perfectly detailed portrait of the woman she had seen in the photo album, but there was something different about her expression. In Caleb's strokes, the polite smile gave way to something darker, almost predatory. "She always looked at Mom like that," Sophia murmured, her voice trembling slightly, "like Mom was one of her experiments." The sound of raised voices coming from the entrance hall made them quickly enter the library. Ruth closed the doors behind them, but not before Helen caught fragments of the discussion. "No right to interfere. The children need professional help. Already caused enough damage." Inside the library, Caleb continued drawing frantically, his hands moving with urgency over the paper. Michael sat beside him, watching, fascinated by the process. Claire and Sophia approached one of the large windows, their eyes fixed on the garden below. "She'll try to take us away again," said Claire, her voice carrying a maturity beyond her years. "Like she tried the last time, when Mum was still." "Claire," Ruth gently warned, but Helen noticed that the housekeeper herself was pale and tense. Helen approached Caleb, who was now showing a new page from his notebook. It was a sequence of drawings like a comic strip, depicting scenes that made her stomach turn. An elegant woman separating the triplets from their mother, whispering something in her ear, manipulating situations to create distance between the family. "Caleb always knew," Ruth spoke softly, looking at the drawings over Helen's shoulder. "He saw everything, recorded everything, but couldn't express it in words. Nobody realized that his drawings were actually a diary of what was happening." A door slamming sound from downstairs made everyone startle. Heavy footsteps climbed the stairs, and soon Edward entered the library, his face a mask of concern and determination. "She's gone for now," he announced, "but she'll return with a court order. She's alleging negligence and psychological risk." Helen felt a wave of protection take over her. She can't do that, not after everything she did. It was then she noticed that Caleb had stood up and was handing his sketchbook to his father. Edward took it with trembling hands, his eyes widening as he turned the pages. "My God," he murmured, falling heavily into a nearby armchair. "All this time, it was all here. Every manipulation, every moment she isolated your mother, His voice failed, and for the first time since Helen had met him, she saw tears in his eyes. Claire and Sophia ran to hug him, while Caleb remained where he was, his hand finding Michael's in a gesture of mutual comfort. "Mrs. Walker," Edward said after a moment, his voice regaining firmness, "we need your help. I can't allow her to do this again. I can't allow her to separate this family once more." Helen looked at the children, at Michael, at the drawings that told a story of manipulation and pain, but also of resistance and love. She took the storybook she always carried with her and pressed it against her chest. "We won't allow it," she replied with conviction. "Together, We'll protect this family. The next morning, the Blackwood mansion felt different. The usual silence had given way to a new energy, as if the entire house were awakening from a long sleep. Edward gathered everyone in the living room, including Ruth, to discuss the next steps. "I received a notification from the court," he began, holding an official paper. "Dr. Regina has requested an emergency hearing to evaluate the children's custody. She's using her influence at the NGO to pressure the judge." Helen, sitting on the sofa with Michael in her lap, observed the children's reactions. Claire maintained her usual protective posture, but there was a tremor in her hands that revealed her fear. Sophia shrank even closer to her sister, while Caleb surprisingly remained calm, drawing in his new notebook. "But she can't simply take the children," Ruth protested, her voice trembling with indignation. "Not after everything that happened." Edward ran his hand over his face, tired. "She has powerful connections and an apparently impeccable reputation in working with neurodivergent children. She's arguing that the children need specialized professional monitoring." It was at this moment that Caleb stood up, approaching his father with his notebook. The pages were filled with new drawings, different from the previous ones. These showed scenes of current life in the mansion. Helen reading stories to everyone, Michael and him sharing moments of silent connection, the sisters smiling. During meals, Edward playing piano while the children drew. "This is our family now," said Caleb, his voice soft but firm, surprising everyone. It was rare for him to express himself verbally so clearly. Edward took the notebook with trembling hands, his eyes scanning every detail of the drawings. "Yes, son, this is our family." Helen felt her eyes fill with tears at the transformation taking place before her. The distant and cold man she had met weeks ago now looked at his son with so much love and understanding that he seemed like a completely different person. "I have an idea," said Helen, remembering something. "Caleb's drawings are not just art, they're documents. They tell a story, show the truth of what happened and what's happening now." Claire approached, interested. "How can the drawings help us?" "We can create a visual diary," Helen explained, her enthusiasm growing. "Not just with the drawings that show the past, but also with records of the present, photographs, videos, testimonials. We can show the judge how the children are flourishing here." Sophia, who rarely participated in family discussions, surprised everyone by saying, "Can I show my poetry notebook? I started writing after Helen arrived." Edward looked at his daughter with surprise and pride. "You're writing poetry?" Sophia blushed but nodded. "They're about our family, about how it's different now, how it's better. And I've kept all the incident reports that the old school made about the children's behavior," Ruth added. "We can compare them with the current reports. The difference is impressive." Michael, who had been quietly observing everything, got up and went to his backpack. He returned with the storybook, opening it to a specific page where there was a note from Peter. "Sometimes the most important stories are those we write together." Helen felt her heart tighten at her son's unintentional wisdom. "That's it," she said, looking at everyone in the room. "Let's tell our story. Not the way Dr. Regina wants to tell it, but our way, with truth, with love, with all the small victories and progress we've made together." Edward stood up, a new determination in his eyes. "I'll call my lawyer right away. And," he hesitated for a moment, looking at Helen, "I'd like you to live here permanently, you and Michael, if you want to, of course." The silence that followed was broken by Claire, who for the first time since Helen had met her, opened a genuine smile. "Please say yes. Michael can stay in the room next to Caleb's, and you can be our real mum," Sophia completed, in a whisper, before covering her mouth with her hands, frightened by her own boldness. Helen looked at Michael, who was smiling serenely, already perfectly at ease in that space that had become his home. Then at the children, who were watching her with hope in their eyes, and finally at Edward, who awaited her answer with an expression that mixed anxiety and something more, something that made her heart beat faster. The days that followed were filled with intense preparation. The mansion, previously immersed in melancholy, gained new life. Helen and the children decided to begin restoration with the garden as a symbol of the family's rebirth. On a sunny morning, everyone gathered among the abandoned flower beds. Edward, who would normally be in his office at this hour, surprised everyone by appearing with rolled-up sleeves ready to help. "Mom loved gardening," Sophia commented as they removed the weeds. She said each flower had its own story to tell. Edward paused for a moment, his dirt-covered hands trembling slightly. It was the first time the children had spoken so openly about their mother in his presence. "She was right," he replied softly. "And I think it's time we discover those stories again." Caleb, who was sitting in the shade of a tree with his notebook, began drawing frantically. Michael approached, watching with fascination as the lines on the paper formed a portrait of the family working in the garden. But there was something different about this drawing. Among the flowers that did not yet exist, an ethereal figure smiled at everyone. "It's Mom," Claire explained to Helen, her voice choked. "Caleb always draws her like that, as if she's watching over us." Helen felt tears in her eyes but continued working. Gradually, the garden began showing signs of life. Ruth brought an old box from the attic, full of photos showing the garden in its days of glory. "Look!" Sophia exclaimed, pointing to one of the photos. The white piano was right there near the rose bushes. Edward approached, his eyes fixed on the indicated spot. Yes, that was her favorite place. "We used to have small outdoor concerts on weekends." "Why did we stop?" asked Claire, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and accusation. Edward took a deep breath before answering. "Because Dr. Regina said it was too much stimulation for you, that we needed a more controlled, more therapeutic environment." His voice faltered on the last word. "But she was wrong," Helen gently interjected. "Children need life, color, music. They need space to be themselves." As if to confirm her words, Michael, who normally avoided new textures, had his hands in the soil, planting small flower seedlings alongside Caleb. The two boys worked in silent synchrony, creating their own patterns in the flower bed. "Mrs. Walker," Ruth called, approaching with another object found in the attic, an old camera. "I found this among Mrs. Olivia's things. She used to photograph all the important family moments." Helen carefully took the camera. "It's perfect. We can document our own story now." Edward watched as Helen organized everyone for a photo. The children, dirty but smiling, positioned themselves naturally. Michael and Caleb side by side, their still dirty hands raised in an identical gesture. Claire and Sophia embracing, for the first time without tension or fear in their eyes. "Wait," Edward said, quickly heading into the house. He returned minutes later, carrying something covered with a cloth. "What is that, Dad?" Sophia asked. Curious. Carefully, Edward removed the cloth, revealing a small portable keyboard. "It's not the original piano, but..." He smiled shyly. "I thought we could start creating new musical memories." The children's eyes shone. Edward positioned the keyboard in the garden, exactly where the white piano used to be. His fingers found the keys naturally, and a soft melody began to flow. Helen captured the moment with the camera. Edward playing, the children around him, the garden beginning to be reborn. But more important than the photo itself was what it represented. A family reconnecting, healing, growing together like the flowers they were now planting. Ruth, observing the scene, murmured something that sounded like a prayer. Mrs. Olivia would be so happy to see this. And for the first time, the name of the children's mother didn't bring pain, only a sweet longing mixed with hope. In the sky, soft clouds danced to the music that now filled the garden, as if the universe itself was smiling at this family. That at last was finding its way back to the light. The afternoon was fading when Ruth found Helen in the mansion's attic, among dusty boxes and stored memories. The housekeeper carried an expression of someone who had finally made a difficult decision. "There's something I need to show you," said Ruth, removing an old key from her apron pocket. With determined steps, she headed to an oak chest hidden under an old velvet curtain. The chest creaked as it opened, revealing dozens of letters, videotapes, and a blue leather-bound diary. "Mrs. Olivia made me promise I would keep this. She said someday someone would need to know the complete truth." Helen took the diary with trembling hands. The pages were filled with delicate yet firm handwriting, words that told a story that should never have been silenced. Olivia began writing when Dr. Regina entered our lives, explained Ruth, her voice heavy with emotion. She sensed something was wrong, that she was being manipulated, but couldn't prove it. The diary's pages revealed a disturbing pattern. Dr. Regina had approached the family offering specialized help for Caleb, but soon began interfering in all aspects of family life. She suggested that musical activities were harmful, that the garden was too stimulating an environment, that the children needed to be separated for individualized treatment. She isolated Olivia from everyone, continued Ruth, showing some letters. She convinced Edward that his wife was emotionally unstable, that her concerns were part of an anxiety condition. Even I began to doubt. Helen found a specific entry in the diary that made her heart ache. Today, Dr. Regina suggested that my love is harming the children, that my desire to keep them together is selfish. But how can it be wrong to want my children to grow up together, supporting each other, loving each other? Claire is so protective of her siblings. Sophia blooms when she's with them. And Caleb, my little artist, only truly communicates through his drawings. Separating them would be like pulling flowers from the same garden, hoping they'll grow better alone. Among the pages, Helen found photographs, happy moments of the family before Dr. Regina's interference. In one of them, Olivia played piano in the garden while the children danced around her. In another, Edward smiled openly, embracing his wife without the shadow of worry he now constantly carried. Mrs. Olivia had a plan, Ruth revealed, taking a sealed envelope from the bottom of the chest. She was gathering evidence, documenting everything. She planned to expose Dr. Regina's manipulative practices, not just with our family, but with others too. Helen carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter addressed to the future. A letter for the person who would one day assume the role of caring for her children. To whoever finds this letter, if you are reading this, it means you have somehow gained the trust of my children. You must have noticed they are special, not because of their differences, but because of their enormous hearts and their capacity to love deeply. Claire may seem tough on the outside, but she feels everything intensely. Sophia holds poetry in her silence, and Caleb. Caleb sees the world in a way few can understand, but his drawings are windows to his soul. I ask that you keep them together, that you allow them to grow together, supporting and strengthening each other. Don't let anyone say that family love is less important than protocols and theories. And if one day Dr. Regina returns, because I know she will, use the truth as your weapon. In this chest is all the evidence of her manipulation, not just with our family, but with others too. There are testimonials, documents, proof that her specialized treatment is just a mask for control and power. Take care of them, love them, and most importantly, let them love you back. With hope, Olivia Blackwood. Helen felt tears streaming down her face as she finished reading. Ruth was also crying silently. Mrs. Olivia knew, said the housekeeper softly. She knew that one day, someone like you would come, someone who would understand that love and acceptance are more powerful than any theory or method. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made them turn. Edward was standing at the attic door, his eyes fixed on the diary in Helen's hands. I never knew. His voice failed, taking 2 uncertain steps forward. All this time, Helen stood up, still holding the diary and the letter. Olivia left everything documented, Edward. She was fighting to protect your family in her own way. The contents of the chest changed everything. Edward spent the entire night in his office reading each letter, watching each video, rediscovering the wife he had lost, not only physically, but also in his manipulated memories. The next morning, the mansion woke up different. Edward gathered everyone in the music room, a room that had remained locked for years. The curtains were opened for the first time in a long time, letting the sunlight dance over the grand piano that dominated the space. Children, he began, his voice carrying a new emotion. Your mother left something for you. Something I've kept for too long. Carefully, he opened the piano and removed a yellowed envelope from inside. She wrote a letter for each of you, and with each letter, he smiled softly. There's a piece of music. Claire was the first to approach, her hands trembling as she took her envelope. Inside was a music score titled Guardian, along with a letter that she began to read aloud. My little protector, your strength is not in toughness, but in the immense love you carry. Continue caring for your siblings, but also allow yourself to be cared for. The music I wrote for you is strong like your spirit, but gentle like your heart. Sophia received a composition called Whispers of Poetry and a letter that spoke about the beauty of her inner voice. Caleb found in his envelope a drawing made by his mother, accompanied by a melody titled Colors of Silence. Edward sat at the piano, his hands hovering over the keys for a moment before he began to play. Claire's music filled the room, a melody that began determined and gradually revealed layers of tenderness, exactly like the girl's personality. Helen watched the scene with Michael in her lap, feeling the little boy relax to the sound of the music. Caleb had sat on the floor, drawing to the rhythm of the melody, while Sophia closed her eyes, letting herself be carried by the harmony. When the last note dissipated in the air, Claire ran to hug her father, something she hadn't done in a long time. Can we play Sophia's music now? Edward smiled, adjusting himself at the piano again, but before he could begin, Sophia surprised him. Can I try? She asked timidly. Mom was teaching me before. Gently, Edward helped her position herself on the piano bench. Sophia's small fingers found the keys with a memory that time had not erased. The first notes of her music were like soft raindrops, growing into a river of contained emotions. Helen noticed that Ruth had entered the room carrying the storybook. The housekeeper opened it to a specific page and began to read softly, her voice blending with the music. There are stories that need to be told not with words but with the heart, stories that speak of love, of loss, of new beginnings, stories that remind us that family is not just who is born with us, but who chooses to stay by our side. Michael slipped from Helen's lap and went to sit next to Caleb, who was now drawing his family. Not as it was before, not as it could have been, but as it was now, imperfect. Different but complete in its own way. Edward observed everything with tear-filled eyes, his hand discreetly finding Helen's. The touch was shy, hesitant, but carried a promise of future. Olivia always said, Ruth commented softly, that music has the power to heal broken hearts, that each note is a chance to rebuild what was broken. Sophia finished playing her music, and the silence that followed was no longer heavy or sad. It was a silence full of possibilities, of hope, of renewed love. She also left a piece of music for you, Edward said to Helen, surprising everyone. From the envelope, he took out a score titled, For Who Comes After. How could she? Helen began to ask, but Edward gently interrupted her. Olivia always said that love finds its way, that when our hearts are open, the right people enter our lives at the exact moment we need them. The music that Edward played next was different from the others. It was a melody that spoke of new beginnings, of courage to love again, of families that are built not just with blood, but with daily choices to stay together. The week before the hearing was intense at the Blackwood mansion. The family's lawyer, Mr. Anthony, spent hours in the office with Edward and Helen, analyzing each document found in Olivia's chest. This evidence is impressive, commented the lawyer, adjusting his glasses while examining a folder. Olivia managed to gather testimonials from other families who went through similar situations with Dr. Regina. The pattern is always the same: isolation, manipulation, attempting to separate the children. Helen was organizing Caleb's drawings, in chronological order, creating a visual narrative that clearly showed the family's transformation. What worries me most is how she's going to try to use my lack of specific training against us. Edward, who was typing on the computer, stopped. Hand looked at her. Helen, you've done more for these children in a few months than all the specialists in the last few years. Sometimes love and understanding are more important than diplomas. A noise coming from the garden caught their attention. Through the office window, they could see the children playing under Ruth's supervision. Michael and Caleb were sitting, under the large tree drawing together, while Claire and Sophia watered the new flower seedlings. "Look at that," Mr. Anthony commented, approaching the window. "These children don't look anything like the problem cases described in Dr. Regina's reports." At that moment, Sophia came running into the office, her eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, Helen, you need to see this. Caleb did something amazing." Everyone followed the girl to the garden, where Caleb was showing his notebook to Michael. The pages revealed a sequence of drawings that told a story, their story. But there was something different. For the first time, Caleb had added words to his drawings. "Family," he read softly, pointing to an illustration that showed everyone together. "Our family." Helen felt tears come to her eyes. It was the first time Caleb had expressed his feelings verbally in such a clear way. Edward knelt beside his son, hugging him carefully. "That's perfect, son," he said, his voice breaking. "It's exactly what we are." Mr. Anthony observed the scene with professional interest and personal emotion. "You know," he commented, "this is exactly what we need to show the judge. Not just documents and evidence, but the real progress, the real connection that exists here." Claire, who had been quiet until then, approached with something in her hands. It was an old video camera that she had found among her mother's things. "What if we made a video?" she suggested. "We could show what our life is like now, how happy we are." The idea quickly gained momentum. Ruth brought more old tapes showing what life was like in the mansion during Dr. Regina's influence period. The contrast would be evident. "We can also include the children's progress at school," Helen added. "The teachers have been sending excellent reports, especially about Sophia's participation in literature classes and Caleb's project presentations." Edward nodded, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "And we can invite the children's grandparents. They were kept away for so long. I'm sure they would be happy to testify on our behalf." "Olivia's parents?" Ruth asked softly. "They never believed Dr. Regina's accusations. They always said there was something wrong with how she approached the family." The mention of the grandparents made Sophia's eyes light up. "Grandma Anne makes the best chocolate cakes in the world," she commented, a shy smile appearing on her face. "And Grandpa John, he used to play guitar with Mom in the garden," Claire added, her voice carrying a mixture of longing and hope. Mr. Anthony was taking quick notes in his pad. "This is great. The more we can show the family support and the healthy environment these children have here, the better our position will be." Michael, who was absorbed in Caleb's drawings, suddenly raised his head and looked at his mother. With gestures that Helen knew well, he indicated he wanted the storybook. "Of course, my love," she replied, understanding immediately. The book had become a symbol of unity for all of them, a bridge between the past and the present. As Helen went to get the book, Edward watched the children playing in the renewed garden. The fear was still there, the concern about the approaching hearing, but now there was something stronger. The certainty that together, as a family, they could face any challenge. Ruth, always attentive, approached him with a cup of tea. "You?" "No, Mr. Edward," she commented quietly. "Mrs. Olivia always said that true love doesn't need protocols or theories. It simply exists and flourishes, like the roses in this garden." Edward smiled, his eyes finding Helen, who was returning with the storybook. "Yes, Ruth, and I'm finally beginning to understand exactly what she meant." The doorbell sound echoed through the mansion on a Sunday morning, announcing the arrival of the children's grandparents. Anne and John Thompson hadn't set foot in that house for years, kept away by circumstances that now began to make painful sense. Helen observed the emotional family reunion through the kitchen window. Claire, always so reserved, ran into her grandparents' arms like a little girl again. Sophia cried silently while hugging her grandmother, and Caleb, surprising everyone, extended his arms to his grandfather without hesitation. "My God, how they've grown," Anne whispered, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Her eyes found Edward, who remained a few steps behind, visibly nervous. "Son," she said simply, opening her arms. John, still embracing Caleb, took a guitar from the car. "I brought something we might use," he smiled, his eyes shining with memories. "If the garden will still accept a bit of music." Ruth, who was observing the scene from the door, quickly wiped her eyes with her apron. "I'll prepare that chocolate cake," she announced, her voice breaking. "The children's favorite." The morning unfolded like a dream. Anne and John brought not only their love, but also boxes of photographs and old videos. Sitting in the living room, they began to fill in the gaps of years of separation. "Olivia used to send us letters," Anne revealed, showing a carefully preserved box. "Even when we were kept away, she found ways to keep us informed. She always said that one day the truth would come to light." Helen, sitting on the sofa with Michael in her lap, observed how the children absorbed every word, every story about their mother. It was as if pieces of a puzzle were finally finding their places. "She was so afraid," John commented, gently strumming the guitar. Not for herself, but for the children. She feared that Dr. Regina would manage to separate them, put them in different programs at the NGO. Edward, who was standing by the window, turned abruptly. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you insist more?" Anne rose, approaching him with soft steps. "Dr. Regina had built a very convincing narrative. She used your concern for the children, your desire to give them the best possible treatment, to manipulate all of us. When we tried to warn you about our suspicions, she had already created an image that we were a bad influence." "But now we have proof," Claire interrupted, her voice firm. "Caleb's drawings, Mum's letters, testimonials from other families." Sophia, who was sitting at her grandmother's feet, added timidly, "And we have Helen. She showed us that we can be different and still be loved." Michael, who had been quiet until then, got up and went to his backpack. He returned with a drawing that he and Caleb had made together, a representation of the entire family, including the grandparents, all united in the mansion's garden. John took the drawing with trembling hands. "You know," he said, looking at Helen, "Olivia always said that love finds its ways, that when one door closes, the universe opens a window." Anne smiled, reaching for her purse. "And speaking of windows," she removed a yellowed envelope. "Olivia gave us this, asking us to keep it for the right moment. I think that moment has come." The envelope contained a letter addressed to the judge, written by Olivia weeks before her passing. In it, she detailed her concerns about Dr. Regina's methods and expressed her deepest desire for her children to remain united, growing in an environment of love and acceptance. "This changes everything," Edward murmured, his voice breaking. "No," Helen gently corrected. "This only confirms what we already knew, that Olivia's love for her children was greater than any protocol or theory, and that love continues alive, guiding us to this day." Ruth returned from the kitchen with the delicious smell of chocolate cake in the fry. Caleb immediately began to draw, his quick hands capturing the moment. The family reunited, the grandfather's guitar, the grandmother's smile, the freshly baked cake. "Family," he wrote again on his drawing, and this time added something more: forever. John began to play a soft melody on the guitar, a song that Olivia used to sing to the children. Sophia, surprising everyone, began to hum along, her sweet voice filling the room. And there, on that Sunday morning, amid music, stories, and the smell of chocolate cake, the Blackwood family felt that, regardless of what happened at the hearing, they had already won, because they had rediscovered the deepest meaning of what it means to be a family. The day of the hearing dawned with a gentle mist covering the city. In the Blackwood mansion, breakfast proceeded in a tense silence, broken only by the sound of cutlery and the occasional turning of pages in Caleb's notebook, who drew incessantly. Helen adjusted Michael's tie, who had insisted on wearing his special outfit, an ensemble that Peter had bought for him before departing. Beside her, Sophia nervously smoothed her light blue dress, while Claire kept her eyes fixed on her untouched plate. "Remember," Edward said softly, "you're not obligated to speak if you don't want to. Mr. Anthony explained that." "I want to." "Speak," Claire interrupted, raising her chin with determination. "I want the judge to know exactly how it was before and how it is now." Sophia nodded, finding courage in her sister's strength. "Me too. I wrote a poem about our family." Caleb looked up from his notebook and showed his latest drawing. It was a representation of the courtroom, but instead of showing a cold and intimidating environment, he had transformed the space into something welcoming, with flowers sprouting from the walls and music flowing from the windows. Ruth, who was finishing preparing lunchboxes for the children, paused to observe the drawing. "That's how we should see it," she commented. "Not as a battle, but as an opportunity to show the truth." The sound of a horn announced the grandparents' arrival. Anne and John would enter the courthouse first, prepared to testify about the years of manipulation and forced estrangement from the family. As everyone headed to the cars, Helen noticed Edward standing in the entrance hall, staring fixedly at one of the now uncovered paintings, a portrait of Olivia at the piano. "She would be proud," Helen said softly, approaching, "of you, of the children, of how everyone has grown through this difficulty." Edward turned to her, his eyes shining, with contained tears. "Thank you," he whispered, taking her hand, "for bringing life back to this house, for teaching us to be a family again." The courthouse was crowded when they arrived. Dr. Regina was already there, impeccable in her grey suit, surrounded by a team of professionals from the Circle of Light. NGO. Her controlled smile faltered slightly upon seeing the entire Blackwood family entering together. Mr. Anthony guided them to their places, organizing the evidence they would present. Olivia's diary, the letters, testimonials from other families, the children's current school reports, and of course Caleb's sketchbooks. "Stay calm," the lawyer advised. "Let the evidence and your stories speak for themselves." Dr. Regina opened the proceedings by presenting an extensive report on the deficiencies in the children's current care. She spoke about the lack of professional structure, the absence of specialized therapies, the risk of keeping neurodivergent children in an environment without adequate technical supervision. But then, something unexpected happened. While she spoke, Caleb began to draw. The soft sound of pencil on paper attracted the judge's attention, who observed with interest how the boy, supposedly incapable of properly concentrating according to the report, created an intricate and meaningful image. "Your Honor," Mr. Anthony gently intervened, "I would like to begin our defense with something special, not with words or technical reports, but with the art of Caleb Blackwood. Through his drawings, he tells us a story that words perhaps cannot fully express." The judge nodded, and so began the true story of the Blackwood family, told through the eyes of a child who saw the world in a unique and extraordinarily beautiful way. One by one, the drawings were presented, showing the family's transformation, from isolation to unity, from sadness to joy, from silence to music. And in each page, each stroke, the love that now filled that once empty house was evident. Helen held Michael's hand while watching the scene unfold. In the bench ahead, Edward maintained a protective arm around Sophia, while Claire firmly held Caleb's hand. United like a true family, they would face any challenge that came. The presentation of Caleb's drawings created a reflective silence in the courtroom. Judge Marcus Wilson studied each image with particular attention, occasionally adjusting his glasses to better observe the details. Dr. Regina shifted uneasily in her chair, her face a mask of professional concern that barely disguised her growing apprehension. When she tried to intervene with comments about structured art therapy and need for a controlled environment, the judge raised his hand, requesting silence. "I would like to hear from the children," he declared, his voice gentle but firm. "If they feel comfortable speaking, of course." Claire was the first to stand. Her eyes met Dr. Regina's without fear for the first time. "Before Helen arrived," she began, her voice clear and strong, "our house was like a hospital. Everything was controlled, measured, analyzed. We couldn't play piano because it caused sensory excitement. We couldn't play in the garden because it was too stimulating an environment. We couldn't even stay together for long because we needed individualized interventions." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "But do you know what we really needed? Love, understanding, someone who saw us as children, not as cases to be studied." Sophia stood next, her hands trembling slightly as she held a paper. "I wrote a poem," she said softly. "May I read it?" With the judge's nod, she began. There was silence where there should be music. There was fear where there should be hugs. There were rules where there should be love, until she came, with stories. And smiles, with patience and understanding. And our house became a home again, where different colors paint the same picture, where different voices sing the same song, where being different doesn't mean being alone. The judge's eyes shone with contained emotion when Sophia finished. Dr. Regina tried to intervene again, but was interrupted by an unexpected voice. "I want to speak too," Caleb announced, surprising everyone. He stood up, holding his sketchbook. Not with words, but like this. He opened the notebook to a specific page and showed it to the judge. It was a sequence of drawings, like a comic strip, showing his evolution since Helen and Michael's arrival. The last frame showed the entire family gathered in the restored garden, including the grandparents, Ruth, and even an ethereal figure that everyone recognized as Olivia, smiling from heaven. "Family," he said simply, his voice calm and clear. "My family." Michael, who was sitting next to his mother, stood up and walked to Caleb, stopping at his side in silent support. The two boys, so different and yet so connected, perfectly represented what that family had become, a place where differences didn't separate but united. Anne and John were called to testify next. They told about the years of forced separation, about Olivia's desperate letters, about how Dr. Regina had systematically isolated the family under the pretext of specialized treatment. "Our daughter knew," Anne declared, her voice breaking. She knew something was wrong, that the children were being harmed by all that isolation. That's why she documented everything, left evidence, letters. John added, "Olivia believed that one day we would find someone who understood that love and acceptance are more powerful than any protocol. And we found her." The couple's gaze turned to Helen, who was firmly holding Edward's hand. At that moment, they weren't just a nanny and her employer, they were two hearts that had found healing and hope in each other. Dr. Regina observed the scene with an increasingly tense expression. Her empire of control and manipulation was crumbling before childlike drawings, sincere poems, and true love. The judge removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully before speaking. "In all my years on the bench," he began, "I've learned that sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't in technical reports or professional evaluations. It's in the children's smiles, the peace in their eyes, the way a family unites and grows together." Helen squeezed Edward's hand, feeling the tremor of emotion that ran through his body. The children approached, forming a protective circle around the parents. United, they awaited the decision that would forever change their lives. The silence in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Marcus Wilson organized his papers. Outside, the afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, projecting colorful patterns on the floor, patterns that curiously resembled Caleb's drawings. "Before rendering my decision," the judge began, "I'd like to make a few observations. During my career, I've presided over numerous cases involving children's welfare. Each one has taught me that there are no ready-made formulas when it comes to family." He paused, his eyes scanning the room before continuing. "Dr. Regina has presented technical arguments about the need for specialized professional intervention. Her reports are detailed, and her concern for protocols is evident." Dr. Regina sketched a smile of satisfaction, which quickly disappeared with the judge's next words. "However, what we've witnessed here today goes far beyond reports and protocols. We've seen a family that has found its own way to grow and heal. We've seen children who don't merely survive but flourish in an environment of acceptance and love." The judge picked up one of Caleb's drawings, observing it carefully. "This young artist has shown us through his strokes the transformation of a house that was a prison into a home that is a refuge. Sophia has gifted us with poetry straight from the heart. Claire has demonstrated admirable maturity and clarity of thought." Turning to Helen and Edward, he continued, "And you two have proven that family isn't just a matter of blood or titles. It's about presence, dedication, and above all, unconditional love." Dr. Regina rose abruptly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, feelings aren't enough when it comes to the development of children with special needs. My program at the NGO, Dr. Regina, The judge firmly interrupted her. "We also have concerning evidence about your methods here. Mrs. Olivia Blackwood's diary, testimonials from other families, records of psychological manipulation." It was Mr. Anthony's turn to speak. "Your Honor, I'd like to inform you that this evidence has already been forwarded to the Psychology Licensing Board and the District Attorney's Office for appropriate investigation." Dr. Regina visibly paled, her empire of control crumbling before her eyes. "Therefore," the judge continued, "it is the decision of this court that the children remain under the custody of their father, Edward Blackwood, with Helen Walker acting officially as second legal guardian if they so wish to formalize." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Sophia began to cry silently, while Claire embraced her tightly. Caleb immediately started drawing, his quick strokes capturing the emotion of the moment. "Furthermore," continued the judge, "I order that Dr. Regina and her organization maintain distance from the Blackwood family. As for the accusations against her methods, these will be investigated by the appropriate authorities." Edward, who had maintained a controlled posture until then, finally let tears flow freely down his face. Helen held his hand tightly, while Michael approached to embrace them both. "There's one more thing," the judge added, a small smile appearing on his lips. "I found this among the evidence presented." He held up a yellowed envelope. "It's a letter from Mrs. Olivia Blackwood addressed to the future. Would you like me to read it?" With the emotional assent of everyone, he began. "To whoever is reading this letter, if these words are being read in a courtroom, it's because my suspicions were confirmed. Dr. Regina, with her theories and methods, tried to destroy what is most precious, the love that keeps our family united. But it also means that someone special, found the way to my children's hearts. Someone who understood that being different isn't being less. That each child is a unique universe of possibilities. To this person, I want to say thank you. Thank you for seeing beauty where others saw only problems. Thank you for hearing music when others heard only noise. Thank you for loving my children as I love them. And to my little ones, never forget that true love doesn't need protocols. It simply is, grows and flourishes, like the roses in our garden. With all my love, Olivia Blackwood." When the judge finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the court officer was discreetly wiping away a tear. The return to Santoi. The Blackwood mansion that afternoon was different from any other. Ruth awaited them at the entrance, and seeing the smiles on everyone's faces, she opened her arms in a gesture that embraced the entire family. "The garden is waiting for you," she said, wiping away her own tears of joy. "I prepared a surprise." Following the housekeeper to the back of the house, everyone stopped, amazed. The garden was decorated with small lights, and in the center, where Olivia's piano once stood, there was a large table set for a special snack. Anne and John were already there, the guitar prepared for a musical celebration. "I thought we could celebrate properly," Ruth explained, revealing a cake decorated with chocolate musical notes. The children ran to explore the transformed space. Sophia discovered that her grandmother had brought old family albums. Claire helped distribute slices of cake, her face more relaxed than ever. Caleb and Michael sat together under the large tree, drawing the scene that unfolded. Edward approached Helen, who watched everything with teary eyes. "So," he began, a slight nervousness in his voice, "what do you think about making it official, not just as the children's legal guardian, but—" Before he could complete the sentence, they were interrupted by Sophia, who ran toward them with an open album. "Look what I found," she exclaimed, showing an old photograph. It was an image of the garden in its days of glory, with Olivia at the piano. But what caught everyone's attention was a detail in the background, an arch of white roses, under which couples danced in what appeared to be a celebration. "It was my parents' wedding," Edward explained softly. "Olivia loved that rose arch. She said it was a magical portal where dreams became reality." Helen smiled, understanding the meaning between the lines. "Perhaps," she replied, her fingers entwining with his. "It's time to plant new roses." John began to play his guitar, a soft melody that was soon recognized by everyone. It was the music Olivia had composed for Helen for Who Comes After. Sophia, surprising everyone, began to sing the lyrics her mother had written. There are paths that the heart knows, even before feet touch the ground. There are loves that time recognizes as part of our salvation. Claire and Caleb approached Helen and Edward, followed by Michael. The children formed a circle around them, as if they instinctively knew they were witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Family, Caleb said softly, showing his most recent drawing. The current garden, full of life and color, with everyone gathered under the future rose arch. In the drawing's sky, stars formed a constellation that resembled Olivia's smile. Anne approached with a small package in her hands. Olivia left this for the right moment, she said, handing it to Helen. Inside was a small notebook, its cover decorated with pressed flowers from the old garden. They're family recipes, Anne explained, but not just for food. They're recipes for love, healing, union. Olivia began writing them when she discovered she would have triplets. The last page remained blank with a note. To be filled by the next guardian of our garden. Edward took Helen's hand, his eyes meeting hers with a silent question. Around them the family waited, love palpable in the air of the afternoon that began to turn golden. Ruth observed the scene with a knowing smile, remembering the words. Olivia always said, "Love is like a garden. It needs daily care, infinite patience, and sometimes a little magic." And there in that reborn garden, as the sun painted the sky pink and gold, as the soft music of the guitar mingled with children's laughter and whispered promises, a new story began to be written. A story of second chances, of love that transcends time, of family that is chosen and built day after day. Michael approached his mother, bringing the storybook that Peter had left. He opened to a specific page where an illustration showed a garden very similar to the one they were in. Below the drawing, a phrase handwritten by Peter said, "Sometimes, the end of one story is just the beginning of another, even more beautiful one." The weeks that followed brought an even deeper transformation to the Blackwood mansion. The garden flourished, not only with the roses that were replanted, but with the love that grew each day. Helen and Edward decided to hold a simple but meaningful ceremony, exactly where the old rose arch used to stand. Claire took on the role of chief organizer, creating lists and schedules with surprising dedication. Sophia composed poems for the occasion, filling page after page with verses about love and family. Caleb expressed his joy through increasingly elaborate drawings which now decorated the house walls. On a particularly special afternoon, as Helen helped Ruth organize Olivia's old room, which would be transformed into a studio for the children, they found a box with the original wedding dress. It was French lace, Ruth explained, running her hands delicately over the fabric. Olivia kept it, hoping that one day the girls might wear it. Sophia, who was helping with the organization, approached the dress timidly. Could we adapt it for you, Helen?" The moment was interrupted by Michael, who came running into the room, holding one of Caleb's notebooks. The drawing showed Helen wearing exactly that dress, but with small modifications, colorful flowers embroidered on the hem, representing each family member. "It's perfect!" exclaimed Claire, who had just arrived. "We can embroider a flower for each of us. Blue for me, pink for Sophia, green for Caleb, yellow for Michael." Edward, drawn by the commotion, stopped at the door. His eyes found the dress, and for a moment, emotion prevented him from speaking. It was as if the past and present intertwined perfectly at that moment. "Olivia would love this," he finally managed to say. "She always believed that love is something that multiplies, never divides." Anne and John, who were spending more time at the mansion helping with the preparations, brought their own contributions to the ceremony. John was teaching the children to play a special song that he and Olivia had composed years ago. Anne, in turn, decided to prepare the wedding cake using the family's traditional recipe. But with a special modification, she explained as she mixed the ingredients in the kitchen. "We'll add a layer with Michael's favorite chocolate to show that we're not just uniting two people, but creating a new family recipe." Caleb, who was carefully observing the process, began to draw the cake in his notebook. But it wasn't just a cake. In his drawing, each layer told a story. The base showed the mansion's garden, The middle represented all the important moments they had lived together, and the top. The top showed a bright star smiling at everyone. "Mom is happy," he said simply, pointing to the star in his drawing. One afternoon, while working in the garden preparing the space for the ceremony, Edward began playing piano on the porch. The music attracted everyone close, as if it were a magical call. Helen recognized the melody. It was the same one he had been secretly composing weeks ago. "It's for you," he explained, without stopping playing. "For all of us, actually. Each note represents one of us, and together they form a complete harmony." Sophia, inspired by the music, took her notebook and began to write. "We are different notes in the same song. We are diverse colors, painting the same emotion. We are distinct stories that meet in love. We are a family that destiny kept safe." Michael, who was sitting next to Caleb under the large tree, suddenly stood up and ran into the house. He returned moments later with the storybook, opening it to the last page where there was a blank space. "For our story," he said, using one of the rare phrases he could form. Helen understood immediately. That blank space would be filled with their story, not just of the wedding, but of how a family can rebuild itself through love, understanding, and acceptance. Ruth, observing everything from the kitchen door, smiled to see how the mansion, once so silent and cold, now overflowed with life and warmth. The walls that once kept secrets now echoed laughter and music. The garden, which had witnessed so many tears, now prepared to celebrate a love that had been born from the purest form of care. The wedding day dawned with a golden light that seemed to bless the Blackwood Mansion's garden. The newly planted roses had bloomed perfectly, forming a natural arch exactly where the old one used to stand. It was as if the garden itself wanted to participate in the celebration. In the old music room, transformed into a space for the bride to prepare, Helen wore the outfit that had been Olivia's, now delicately modified with the embroidered flowers representing each family member. Sophia and Claire helped with the final details while Anne arranged a small bouquet of garden flowers. "Something old," Anne said, adjusting the dress. "Something new," she continued, showing the embroidered flowers. "Something borrowed," she completed, placing a delicate pearl necklace that had been hers. "And something blue." She hesitated. But Caleb entered the room at that moment, bringing one of his framed drawings, a night sky full of blue stars forming a familiar constellation. In the next room, Michael was getting ready with Edward and John. The boy carefully held the storybook, which would have a special role in the ceremony. Edward was adjusting the little one's tie when he noticed something different about the book. There were new pages at the end. "It's our story," Michael explained softly, showing the pages where Caleb had drawn and Sophia had written poems, telling the family's journey to that moment. The ceremony would be conducted by Judge Marcus Wilson, who had become a friend of the family. The guests were few and special. Besides the grandparents and Ruth, only some of the children's teachers and families who had become friends during the judicial battle. When the music began, a special composition played by John on the guitar and Edward on the piano, everyone turned to see Helen entering the garden. Michael walked beside her, carrying the storybook as if it were the most precious of treasures. Claire and Sophia came right behind, scattering rose petals, while Caleb walked with his sketchbook, recording each moment. Judge Marcus smiled to see the family gathered under the rose arch. "We are here," he began, "to celebrate not just the union of two people, but the birth of a new family constellation, a family that has taught us that true love doesn't need protocols or theories. It simply is." Edward and Helen exchanged vows that spoke not only of their love for each other, but of their dedication to all the children. Each of them had their special moment in the ceremony. Claire read a text she had written about protection and trust. Sophia recited a poem about hearts that meet through music. Caleb showed a series of drawings that told the family's story from the difficult days to that moment of celebration. And Michael, surprising everyone, opened the storybook and read with his soft but clear voice the last page that had been written by his father, Peter. Sometimes the universe has mysterious ways of healing broken hearts. It brings together people who need each other, creates music where there was silence, makes flowers bloom in abandoned gardens. And most importantly, it teaches us that family is much more than blood. It's choice, it's care, it's love that renews itself each day. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden when the rings were exchanged. They were simple rings, but they carried a special meaning. They had been made with gold from Olivia's and Peter's rings, united in a new jewel that symbolized the continuity of love through life's transformations. After the ceremony, as everyone celebrated with Anne's special cake and danced to the music played by John, Edward and Helen watched their children playing. In the garden, Caleb and Michael drew together under the large tree. Claire taught Sophia to dance, and Ruth took photographs of all the moments. "Look," Sophia suddenly called, pointing to the dusk sky. A particularly bright star had appeared, even before complete nightfall. "It's Mum," Caleb said with certainty, already beginning to draw. She always said she would be present in important moments. Edward embraced Helen while the children gathered around them. There, under the sky that began to fill with stars, they were more than a family. They were a unique constellation where each member shone with their own light, but together they formed something even more special. "And they lived happily ever after?" Michael asked softly, looking at the storybook in his hands. "No," Helen replied with a gentle smile. "We'll live one day at a time with love, patience, and the certainty that together we can overcome any challenge." Autumn came to the Blackwood mansion, bringing a gentle rain of golden leaves to the garden. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and the house pulsed with renewed energy. The walls, once covered with white cloths, now displayed a unique art gallery. Caleb and Michael's drawings told the family's story in colors and strokes that complemented each other perfectly. On a particularly special afternoon, the mansion filled with visitors, families who had gone through similar experiences with the Circle of Light NGO. After the hearing and the revelations about Dr. Regina's methods, other people began to come forward, sharing their own stories. Helen and Edward decided to transform part of the mansion into a support center for families with neurodivergent children. Not a clinical or therapeutic center, but a welcoming space where differences were celebrated instead of treated. "Welcome to the Garden of Stars," Claire proudly announced to the visitors, using the name Sophia had created for the project. The two girls had become natural hosts, guiding families through the space with a confidence that would have been unthinkable months ago. In the music room, now always open and illuminated, Edward gave piano lessons to children who, like Caleb, communicated better through art. The white piano, restored and returned to its place of honor, once again filled the house with melodies. Ruth, who continued to be the beating heart of the house, had transformed the old kitchen into a welcoming space where parents could share experiences while the children played in the garden. The aroma of her famous hot chocolate often attracted everyone for comforting conversations. Anne and John were constant presences, bringing music and stories that kept Olivia's memory alive in a sweet and natural way. John's guitar now had company. Several children from the project had become interested in music, forming a small group that rehearsed in the garden. Michael, who previously communicated mainly through gestures, began taking small steps toward verbal expression, inspired by Sophia's poetry. The two children developed a special bond, spending hours sharing stories, he through drawings, she through words. Caleb surprised everyone by beginning to give small art workshops to other children. His drawings, once solitary, became collaborative. On a special wall of the center, a large mural grew day by day with contributions from all the children who passed through. "Everyone draws in their own way," he simply explained to new visitors. "Like the stars, different but all shining." One afternoon, while watching the children playing in the garden, Helen found a new drawing in Caleb's notebook. It was different from the others. It showed the mansion seen from above, as if it were a photograph, taken from the sky. In the drawing, the garden formed a pattern that resembled a constellation, and each person was represented by a small bright star. "This is how Mum sees us now," he explained, pointing to a particularly bright star that seemed to smile at the others. She's happy because we transformed sadness into something beautiful. Edward, who approached at that moment, hugged his son. You know, Caleb, your mother always said that stars are like beacons. They don't exist just to shine, but to guide others who are lost in the dark. Sophia, who was nearby composing a new poem, looked up from her notebook. That's what we're doing here, isn't it? Being beacons for other families. Claire completed the thought. Like Helen was for us. The sound of children's laughter filled the air as a group of children ran by, chasing soap bubbles that Michael was blowing. Each bubble reflected the sunlight, creating small rainbows that danced through the garden. Ruth, observing the scene from the porch, smiled to see how Olivia's prophecy had come true. The mansion, once a place of isolation and sadness, had transformed into a beacon of hope for many families. Love finds its ways, she murmured, recalling the words of her old friend. Like water that springs between stones, like flowers that grow in concrete, like stars that shine even on the darkest nights. On a starlit spring night exactly 1 year after Helen's arrival at the Blackwood mansion, the family gathered in the garden for a special celebration. The space was illuminated by hundreds of tiny lights, as if the stars had descended to join the festivities. The old storybook occupied a place of honor on a table decorated with garden flowers. Its pages, now augmented with the family's stories and drawings, told not just fairy tales but the real story of how love can transform lives. "I have a surprise," announced Edward, sitting at the piano. His hands began to play a melody that everyone recognized. It was the music that Olivia had left for Helen, for Who Comes After. But there was something different. New notes intertwined with the original melody, creating a richer and more complex harmony. "It's our story," he explained, continuing to play. "Each new part represents one of us, as if we were completing the music that Olivia began." Sophia, inspired by the music, stood up to recite her newest poem. "We are more than a family. We are a constellation where each star shines with its own song, different but united by the love that guided us in a dance of destinies that time has blessed." Caleb, seated with his inseparable sketchbook, was giving the final touches to a special work, a portrait of the entire family, including Olivia, as a bright star in the sky. In the drawing, the garden transformed into a field of stars, and each person emanated their own unique light. Claire, who had become a strong and sensitive young woman, hugged her brother when she saw the drawing. "It's perfect, Caleb. It shows exactly what we are." Michael, who now expressed himself more and more through words, took the storybook and opened it to the last page. With his soft but clear voice, he began to read the text that Helen had written that morning. "There are stories that begin with once upon a time and end with happily ever after. But the most beautiful stories are those that continue to be written each day with love, patience, and the courage to accept that each person is a unique universe of possibilities." Our story didn't begin as a fairy tale. It began with loss, with pain, with challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. But it was precisely through these difficulties that we learned the greatest of all lessons. That family isn't just who is born with us, but who chooses to stay by our side, who accepts us as we are, who helps us shine with our own light. Today, when I look at our garden full of life, at our house full of music and art, at each smile that illuminates the faces I've learned to love so deeply, I know that we found something much more precious than a happily ever after. We found a happy each day, with all its imperfections, challenges, and moments of pure joy. And so, our constellation continues to grow and shine, guiding others who, like us, are searching for their own place under the stars. Ruth brought a special cake, decorated with small sugar stars. Anne and John softly played a melody on the guitar, while the children distributed pieces of cake to all present. Edward embraced Helen, observing his family, not just those physically present, but also those who lived in their hearts. In the EDT sky, a particularly bright star seemed to twinkle in approval. "You know," Helen said softly, "when Peter departed, I thought our story had ended. But he was right when he wrote that the end of one story might just be the beginning of another, even more beautiful one. And there, under the starry sky, surrounded by love, music, and the magic of a reborn garden, the Blackwood family continued writing their story. A story that taught that differences aren't barriers, but bridges, that love